Is the central panel of our weekend. We've assembled experts in the field who are widely known and have a lot to say about our subject today. And I'm sure it has not escaped your attention that we have also selected people invited, we're very grateful that they came, who have differing views on church architecture, and that's something we hope that in the following discussion period we'll have a really vibrant discussion on. So please help me to do that. What we'll do, just so you know the format, is we'll have three presentations right in a row. Dennis McNamara, and then Duncan Stroik, and then Craig Hartman. I'll introduce each. When that's complete, I'll have a little break, and I'm going to give everybody 3x5 cards and ask you to, or even a scrap of paper if you have it now, to write down some questions for me that I can then direct to the panelists. We'll do that for about an hour, and then we'll just open it wide open to whoever, whatever questions people want to ask. So, with that, let me introduce Dennis McNamara. Dr. Dennis McNamara is Assistant Director and Faculty Member at the Liturgical Institute of the University of St. Mary of the Lake, a graduate program in liturgical studies founded by Cardinal Francis George of Chicago in the year 2000. He holds a BA in the History of Art from Yale University and a PhD in Architectural History from the University of Virginia, where he concentrated his research on the study of ecclesiastical architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries. Dr. McNamara makes a specialty of bridging the gap between the Church's great artistic tradition and the documents of the Second Vatican Council by understanding today's liturgical architecture as sacramental buildings, which shows the continuity of the Old Testament temple tradition as well as a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem. He has also done groundbreaking research on the sacramental meaning of the classical architectural tradition. He has served on the Art and Architecture Commission of the Archdiocese of Chicago and works frequently with architects and pastors in church renovations and new design. He's appeared on Catholic and secular television and radio and is a frequent presenter in academic as well as parish settings. Dr. McNamara is the author of numerous articles on art and architecture in Communio, Rite, Chicago Studies, Sacred Architecture, Environment and Art Letter, Assembly, The Priest, Homiletic, I'm sure I could go on a very long time, Pastoral Review, Letter and Spirit, The Classicist and Art Heiress, Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. His book, Heavenly City, which I own, The Architectural Tradition of Catholic Chicago, appeared on the Catholic bestseller list and won a Benjamin Franklin Award from the Independent Booksellers Association, as well as 2 first-place awards from the Midwest Independent Publishers Association. His book, Catholic Church Architecture in the Spirit of the Liturgy, appeared in late 2009. I actually have that as well. And he's currently working on a new title, How to Read Churches. So please help me welcome Dr. McNamara.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure, dear. I remember not too long ago I was a graduate student and I would hear these long introductions and think the person was so impressive, and now I'm just the same schmo I always was and get introductions like that. And it's a good thing, I come to architecture as a scholar of architectural history, but I come to the faith as a Christian. And so this is the way I think about architecture. I was once a young fogey with a lot of narrow-minded ideas about things, and then began to read and read and read, and then fairly recently this quote changed the way I think about all of this stuff. Oh, I think the black screen's on. Oh. This is a quote from Paul Evdokimov, who's a very well-known theologian in the Eastern tradition of the Church, who says, "It is perfectly legitimate to search for new forms, but these forms must express a symbolic content that remains the same throughout the centuries because it has a heavenly origin. Modern builders must listen to and appreciate the suggestions of the chief architect, the angel of the temple." What does this mean? Architecture is changing, and it's always unchanging. There is a pre-existing reality for what a church is supposed to be that is not about Gothic, Renaissance, Classical, or anything else, although it may be expressed as Gothic, Classical, Renaissance, or anything else. And what follows from this is this big point, that a church building is a sacrament, and I underline the small s there, of the time when the victory of Christ will be completely applied and the earth is restored and divinized, that means made like God, and heaven and earth are intimately united. I never learned this in architecture school. This is the central question of church architecture. What does the church show us? It shows us our heavenly future by drawing it backward in time. It's called anticipated eschatology, and the language of anticipated eschatology runs through the entire document of Sacrosanctum Concilium. We have a foretaste of the heavenly liturgy. Church architecture should be signs and symbols of heavenly realities. We sing the praise of God with the army of the angels and the saints. This is all anticipated eschatology. That's what we say when we sing the Sanctus at Mass, but the building allows us to see it with our eyes as well. So this is going to seem a little edgy, and I promise I'm really not a mean person. But here we go. This means that a church is not primarily evidence of the spirit of the age, although it may be. It is not primarily a space. It is not primarily proof that the Catholic Church is still relevant to secular culture, although it may be. It is not primarily a functional problem to solve, although it will be. It is not a meditation on form and light, evidence of plastic emotion, or a thing which is somehow emotive, although it might be. It is not a skin for liturgical action which need not look like anything else. Thank you to the American bishops for that phrase in the document Environment, Art, and Catholic Worship. And it is not bland, boring, dull, lifeless, anthropocentric, or vague. All right, well, if it's not this, then what is it? It is evidence of the eternal taking possession of the temporal. Everything that's ever happened in history is inserted into the timelessness of the liturgy. Past, future, present, all conflate and exist in our own time. It is a building, rather than a space, which takes the character that the design gives it, and it becomes not a sacred space, but sacred space, at solemn consecration when the Holy Spirit is invited to dwell therein. It is proof that the church can fulfill and uplift the secular culture. It is a theological reality to reveal, which also has functional questions to answer. And it is also a revelation of the signs and symbols of heavenly realities, the quote from Vatican II, which primarily has a revelatory logic understood in the intellect, which then spills over into the emotions, or provides an affective or emotional response which then can be elevated and validated by intellectual inquiry. This is not Corbusier's language. Corbusier said, I'm not a church builder. I refuse to build churches, but if you tell me you want an interesting building where people assemble and light goes over a surface and they experience plastic emotion, I'll do that. This is documented in letters with great articles about it. And lastly, it is not a skin for liturgical action, but a theological reality which corresponds ontologically, that means in its being, what it is in being, as perfectly as possible to the realities of heaven, so as to allow us full, conscious, active, and fruitful participation in them, and then therefore become more heavenly ourselves. So it indeed looks like something. And it is pulsing with life, energizing, radiant, theocentric, centered on God, and specific. And it shares in these three great ologies. Every sacramental theologian learns these, and I owe Monsignor Francis Mannion a debt for these. He said, a church shares in eschatology, the eschaton, the end times. It's not end of the world, earthquake stuff, although people think of it that way. It's the end times when the victory of Christ is completely applied and the effects of the fall are overcome. Chaos, sin, death, sadness, sorrow, incompleteness are overcome. And we're divinized and made like God. Cosmology, the world, creation fell when humanity fell in the garden. So all of creation has to be restored. Nature, stars, humanity, and then there'll be angels and saints as part of the creation as well. And then there's doxology, and it's glory. The knowledge of glory, what gives glory to God, and how we celebrate that divine glory. And of course, all of this should be legible, approachable, attractive, loving, and welcoming. So how can a church be all this? I mean, if you take this seriously, it's a little bit scary. How the heck do I do this? I gave a talk once at a room full of architects, and they said, some guy stood up at the end and said, yeah, that's great, but what do you want me to do? What do you want me to draw? Well, draw Heavenly Jerusalem. Well, it's hard, right? How do you do that? Well, here's how you start. It fulfills God's great deeds and his plan of salvation. That's the bringing of the past forward. But in our own time, it is a sign, and this comes from the Catechism, of the church, the people of the church, living in a place, the dwelling of God with men reconciled and united in Christ. In other words, people who have moved along on their path to restoration and undoing the fall that shows Christ to be present in this place. That's why a church needs to look like a church. It doesn't need to look like any particular church, but it's a marker to the people in the area that there are Christians here and they worship there even if they don't happen to be there at that time. And then lastly, they are signs and symbols of heavenly realities, a foretaste of the heavenly liturgy, the sacrament of heaven, and then, as you know, you need bathrooms, bride rooms, parking, elevator, offices, and all that stuff. And Pope Benedict summed up Christian history in these nice three periods. He actually got this from St. Gregory the Great, and he said, history can be understood as the time of the Old Testament and the shadow, all the preparations for Christ, temple, priest, victim, prophet, king. And then there is a reality in our heavenly future. That's when what is incomplete now in the fallen world becomes complete. That's what's real about us. A tooth with a cavity is not really a tooth. It's less than a tooth. And we as humans are less than we should be because we haven't yet been restored with grace. And that time will come. That's when heaven and earth, the two separated at the fall, are restored with divine life and eternal takes possession of historical reality. But we're in the in-between time, the time of the image, when the victory is being applied and the application is not yet complete. And Pope Benedict compared this to a blueprint. You have the idea of the reality of the church, but it's in construction. It's not there yet. But you know that there's a there, even though you're not there. So if you like to think of the liturgy this way, this dotted line with the X's in it is the liturgy. It's where heaven, all the things of completion in the heavenly future, come back to our time, and all the things we do with matter, whether it's paint, gold, wood, steel, glass, the human voice, our ears, flowers, incense, the sweet smell of prayer, the sweet smell of the restored world, are all brought to meet that line, and then we have this meeting of anticipating our heavenly future. So we gather, that's the Jewish tradition of the synagogue, to hear the words of the Lord, and then move on to offer the word in a sacrifice of praise. That's how the temple gets brought into the church as well. It's not a sacrifice of animals, it's a sacrifice of the word, Christ, in words, which is true worship. And the basic idea is to take this, the fall, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears, and turn it into this, where there's no mourning, no weeping. Everything is in right order and relationship. Chaos, disorder, has been returned to cosmos, which is the Greek word for order. And that's where we get the word cosmetics from, by the way. So if you put makeup on today, you put order on your face after a night of sleep. So church architecture shows the fall undone and allows us to participate fully, consciously, actively, fruitfully in that so that we might become heavenly. If you want to run a marathon, you don't sit in the room, eat Doritos, and say, I wish I could run a marathon, I wish I could run a marathon. What do? You get up and you run a half mile, and it hurts. And there's an ascetic disciplining of the body by doing that which you want to be and want to be able to do. And eventually you become a marathon runner in your body and your mind. And by looking at heaven, you become heavenly. You don't sit in an empty room and say, boy, I don't know what heaven is. You look at heaven, you speak the words of heaven, and you hear the words of heaven, and you touch heaven, and you smell heaven. This is very difficult, I will admit. But here's the problem. You can't even attempt to do it well unless you know what you're doing. That's really important. So let's talk about the biblical foundation in the Old Testament. There's an image of Solomon building the temple, and you see the guys up there with masons and hammers, and he's got the blueprints in his hand. If you were to visit the Temple Mount in the time of Christ, and you see all these references in the Acts of the Apostles, this is what it would have looked like. Herod was a client king of Rome, and the visitors to the Roman Temple Mount said it compared favorably to anything done in Rome, any forum by Trajan or whoever it was. Great buildings, large Corinthian columns all the way across here, very large Corinthian columns in this building here, which is a basilican hall with a high center and two lower side aisles. It looked a lot like the first churches built under Constantine. So anybody who says Constantine simply dumped Roman architecture onto the house church forgot that Jesus was walking in a Roman basilica himself. And so were the apostles meeting there in the royal stoa. And the logic was that when they built the temple, God's presence came into the temple and landed atop the Ark of the Covenant in the little room in the back. So if you like the plan, you have a porch and a big room and a little room in the back. The big room was where the priests would go, and then once a year the high priest would go right in there into the Holy of Holies, in between the winged cherubim, into the Ark of the Covenant where God's presence would dwell. Now if you've ever seen a narthex, a nave, and a sanctuary, you might begin to understand the temple roots of a church. And if you look at it in section, and the descriptions in the book of Kings, the Hekal, the big room, was made of cedar panels covered in gold, and carved with cherubim, angels, palm trees, roses, gourds, flowers. There are even some records that said people would put jewels in the walls. What do we have here? A glorified image of the Garden of Eden. Not going back to the garden, but going beyond the garden to the glorified new heaven and new earth. Think about this every time you go to a church and you see buds, leaves, and flowers carved in the capitals, in the walls, in the doors. It's the restoration of the garden. And this is all biblical language. In the Genesis, Adam and Eve dwell in a garden. There's no temple there because the garden is where they meet God. It's only after the fall that their access to God is restricted. And they're driven out of the garden, and so the temple was understood as the garden, this part here in particular. And lots of language about the desert would become a garden again, that the fall would be undone. And all that image, if you ever go from Jerusalem to the Sea of Galilee, you have to go through this terrible desert, and then the Sea of Galilee is like a tropical jungle with orange trees and waterfalls. And you could see the Jewish mind understanding the restoration of the world in that way. Then you had to pass through the veil, right here. And if you've heard that expression, passing through the veil, meaning death, that is what the high priest did. Went from the garden into meet God in heaven, which is what this room stood for. And it was a cube, by the way, 20 cubits on each side. And the high priest wore these kind of vestments. He wore the name of the Lord on his head in a golden plate. And actually, they distinguished the name Yahweh as the Lord from the Ancient of Days. That was the God who, the high priest, as the Lord, the image of Christ, went in to meet the Father. And there's an implied Trinitarian theology, even in Jewish worship. And he, importantly, had 4 rows of gems on his breastplate. And they're described in several places in Scripture. And they're inscribed with the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, if you want to restore the world, what do? You want to bring it all to God, to the presence of God. The presence of God is holy and confers holiness. You can't get all the 12 tribes of Israel in a little room in the temple. So he wears them vicariously. And he also wears a fabric vestment made of these 4 different kinds of wool and linen that represent the earth, the sea, the sky, and other things of the earth. The sardonyxes on his shoulders were lightning and thunder, image of the power of God. And then the sun and the moon, the bells were thunder, the pomegranates were lightning, sun and the moon on his shoulders. So he's acting as the Lord, taking all of creation into the presence of God, then coming out, bringing the blood of bulls in there, and then coming out, pouring it on the altar and sprinkling it on the people. The temple is a microcosm of heaven and earth restored. And this is the model for the church. You go in there and see the Ark of the Covenant. Usually they represent some kind of glowing light in the center between the angels. Here are these things like from the Psalms. The Lord reigns. He sits enthroned between the cherubim. Let the earth shake. And there's a beautiful homily from Easter Saturday, Holy Saturday, that says that the Lord wants to share this throne. The throne awaits you. He's talking to the people of the world, that the victory of Christ has established the wedding hall, the banquet hall for all of eternity, that we're going to sit on the throne of God as we become restored to be like God. So you see this basic plan of a church. Porch, hollow bronze columns, a large room representing the garden, a small room in the back where God's presence abides with the people of Israel. Tabernacles start to make sense now, don't they? The golden box where God's presence abides with his people, even though it's no longer limited to a little room in the back. So the temple was mythical space and time where earthly and eternal were one. The priests were important as they mediated between the worlds of heaven and earth. And they acted as the Lord, going beyond the veil and then coming back with the blessings and distribute it to the people. So what does this tell us about art and architecture? They can allow us to perceive otherwise invisible spiritual realities, which is a very broad definition of a sacrament. And John Paul II called icons sacraments because they reveal not just a saint, but a saint as they exist in heaven. They're freed from the passions. Pope Paul VI had an address to the artists of Rome, and he said that they were sharing a ministry very similar to his own, that just as priests could make Christ present in the Eucharist, they were making Christ present in imagery. Ralph Adams Cram, by the way, called artists a minister in minor orders. So if you're going to make a building that's like heaven in order to become heavenly, what do you have to know about it? Well, it's united, heaven and earth are united and glorified. It's radiant with the light of Christ, symbolized by a radiant garden. One scholar called the temple a jeweled garden where the angels live, which would be a beautiful description of any new church that you might want to build. And that it's in the shape of God. That is, God is all, in all. Everything has been restored to what God wants it to be. So what do we use to make this image of the heavenly future? Stone, glass, steel, wood, iron, bronze, all the things that architects and artists use. The dust of the earth. But they're transformed, and the authority is 2 things. The law in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament, the new law of Christ, particularly the incarnation, which was evidence that God, who was invisible, could become visible in matter, right? Christ's body is made of wood, water, and carbon, and calcium, and all the things we're made of. But then at the transfiguration, when the radiance of heaven didn't destroy his body, but his body radiated the glory of heaven. So matter can reveal God, and it can reveal glory. That's the basis for building churches like this. If you have the reality, the heavenly reality, well, what can you do? Mosaic, little pieces of glass, gold, stone. And what can you see? The golden background of heaven, radiant, angels, saints, the whole mystical body of Christ represented. You see the stars behind Christ. You see the vines of the leaves. You see birds happy in there. Earth is restored. Heaven and earth have become one. And that's why the language of the liturgy is called the wedding feast of the Lamb. You know, just think about, you go to a wedding, what do you see? The groom's at the far end of the aisle, and the bride suddenly appears and is at the other end of the aisle, and the groom cannot wait. Bride, come here, come here, come here, come here, come here. Come to me, my love. Come to me, my love. They play great music. They take a long time. It's a procession down to meet the groom, and the two become one. And what grows out of that, ideally, is new life from the love of the two who were separated. So a church is the cosmic wedding of all time. It's the party that celebrates the reuniting of heaven and earth. And this is the language of Vatican II. There it is, in case you don't believe me. It's right there. Signs and symbols of heavenly reality, worthy, becoming, and beautiful. You can do a lot of interpretation of what the Latin words mean, worthy, becoming, and beautiful. We don't have time for it now, but they mean very specific things. This is not a vague sense of, oh, maybe there's a God somewhere. This is, I'm going to experience the realities of heaven in matter with specificity and delight. So what are they? What can we guess by reason? Ordered or disordered? Oh, come on. Heaven disordered? Or heavenly realities? Centered on God or centered on something else? Centered on God. Empty or populated? Populated. The Trinity's a community. The angels are a community. The saints are a community. Even the souls in purgatory are part of that community because they're praising God on the edge of glory. And it's perfected, not flawed. Radiant with the light of Christ. And Revelation, the book of Revelation, tells us even more. So when you see a mural like this was done in 1928, it's not just old-fashioned stuff, although it might art historically have some precedent you could describe. But it shows the fall undone. It reveals to us the heavenly future and shows it to us now, making visible in material that which would be otherwise invisible, unless you're a mystic. Typically, you don't get carried off to heaven to see it. And I gave a talk once, and I said, none of us in here is a mystic. And some lady came up to me at the end and said, well, I am a mystic. And I said, oh, sorry. But that would be the extraordinary form of understanding the sacred heavenly realities. The ordinary form is we have eyeballs, right? How do we see things with the senses? How do we hear things with the ears? How can we participate in that which is outside of this world unless it's mediated by earthly stuff? And that is what a sacrament is. This is an anticipated eschatology, and there's the quote from Vatican II. We take part in a foretaste of that heavenly liturgy which is celebrated in the holy city of Jerusalem. And then the book of Revelation. St. John has a vision of heaven. The angel takes him around heaven, and it should be every architect's dream. They have a measuring rod, and they measure heaven. This is what it looks like. There's a throne, one seated on the throne, a rainbow that looks like an emerald. A gem is a very specific thing biblically, so is a rainbow. Light plus water, making the rainbow and water in the Old Testament as a source of chaos and destruction. When Christ could quell the Sea of Galilee and walk on water, that meant he could control evil, he could control chaos, he could control the results of the fall. And then there are these 24 elders dressed in white robes, which is the symbolic language for the clothing of heaven, and golden crowns on their heads because of the victory of Christ. And then who else is there? A great multitude, every nation, all tribes, and people and languages standing before the throne and the Lamb. So salvation is from the Jews, but it's for everyone. So it's filled with heavenly beings, angels and saints, and it's a community praising God. So look at this church from Wheeling, West Virginia in the early 20th century. This is a great mural by Felix Lieftuchter. And the one seated on the throne, surrounded by angels and saints, and the restored cosmos. Notice these stars are not little pinpricks of light in the sky like a planetarium. They've become like flowers, bursting, glorified beyond what they would have been in the fallen world. And the heavenly communities are there, the white-robed elders, and then the waves of water coming down, the river of the water of life. That's the grace of the Holy Spirit that's turning the earthly desert into paradise once again. And so when you go further in the book of Revelation, this is where they measure it. The angel had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, and its length is the same as its width and its height, so it is a cube. Now this doesn't mean that heaven looks like this, right? You do not want to be literal. In fact, in case you need a reminder, there it is. If you're old enough to remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind, this sort of like that. The aliens come floating cube in the sky. That's not what it is. But let's talk about numbers for a second, because in the Middle Ages they had all these theories about numerical meanings, and it's a whole great tradition in the church. And one of them said that the Son really could be understood as the multiplication of the Father, because the Father poured himself completely into the Son. So it wasn't just God plus one, but it was actually God multiplying himself, so that the Son was the square of the Father. And then if you include that process with the Trinity, it's the cube of the Father. And so it's just symbolic language that God has this corporate oneness that is also a threeness as well. So 3 and 1 exist in the cube, and you can see how Leonardo da Vinci figured that out, that we fit into a square, and of course Vitruvius figured it out first, so that the shape of Christ, the square, also appears in us as being created in the image and likeness of God. And you can do all kinds of things with the cube. People have found that the Star of David fits in the center, and a lot of medievals would build radiating chapels and apses based on those circles and so on. This is what a cubic church looks like, right? This is very strong in the Eastern tradition. A dome, a circle, no beginning, no end. The internal movement of God comes down. The cube, which is what earth has been restored to the shape of God, meets it. And this is a very positive operative theology of architecture in the Byzantine church that I think the West could learn from. Not that it has to be a cube, but you think about the theory behind it. And then what does it look like? The walls are built of jasper, pure gold. The foundations have every stone, 12 of them. Notice 12 stones, same ones as the breastplate of the high priest. Now they stood for the people of Israel. These are now the living stones of the church. Gem-like, radiant, and conformed to a heavenly reality, which is a community. That's why it's a city. And so you can go to the internet and find every kind of crackpot theory about which stone represents which tribe, and which stone represents which apostle, and therefore which apostle went out to the world and brings all the Gentiles in. It doesn't matter which is which. The point is that heaven is made of us, but us glorified. And what's a gem, right? Diamond is carbon, transformed. Bodies are nature, grace transforms us. Aluminum oxide, pretty dull. Got Coke cans over there made of aluminum. Add a little heat, pressure, and chromium, and you get a ruby. So here's the symbol of soul, grace, nature plus grace, making us a saint and then assembling us into a community in praise of God. Here's somebody's literalization of that at the Armenian Orthodox Cathedral in Jerusalem. But this is what a church building is. It's an image of this reality. When the ecclesia, the church of people, human, angels, saints, and creation are restored and intimately united to God. So in cosmology, creation. Eschatology, this completion. Doxology, it's glorious, it's wonderful. And the more a church allows us to perceive this, in whatever way you choose to do that, Gothic, Renaissance, classic, modern, concrete, stone, steel, the more it is close to its ontology and the more beautiful you could say it is, properly speaking. So this leads us to us. What do? Not everybody can afford giant murals. This is a tiny chapel in a church. The cherubim guarding the presence of God on the tabernacle, just right out of the temple. The lamb standing as if slain from the book of Revelation. The angel with the incense. The angel was described as bringing incense to the throne of God in heaven. You see it in churches like Santa Persede. It's not just old-fashioned stuff made of mosaics. What is it? At the top, there are the white-robed elders going into the heavenly Jerusalem with their crowns, just like the image from the book of Revelation. I don't know. Oh, here's my laser pointer. You see them up there. The angel guarding the gate. The walls are made of gems, and here are angels. Here's the Lamb on the throne, and then scenes from the life of Christ. So the past, the present, and the future all interact together in this church. You go to St. Mark's in Venice, you see the same thing. Every bit of it is covered in golden, radiant images of the mystical body. Or even Sainte-Chapelle, where the mosaics have been replaced by glass. Now, one of the things that the book of Revelation says is there's no sun or moon in heaven because the light of Christ is their light, and that's why icons in the Orthodox tradition do not have raking light across their faces like a Caravaggio painting, because the light radiates out from them. And a stained glass is like a gem in its colors and radiance, but it also allows light to pass through it. So in a stained glass window, you actually see a saint in glass with light radiating out of it in a jewel-like perfection. Doesn't mean everything has to be stained glass all the time. What it does mean is stained glass is a very close analog to the biblical descriptions of heaven. Even at a place like St. Peter's with its hollow bronze columns, clearly evoking the Temple of Solomon, even though the Temple of Solomon didn't have the swirly columns. I know this has been discussed already. But here's a little side chapel at St. Patrick's Cathedral, a jeweled garden where the angels live. Notice the buds, the flowers, the leaves, and a little saint there in the bottom right. And if you saw the whole picture, you'd see Christ as well. Now, even the floor of the sanctuary of the Cathedral of Wheeling, West Virginia, What are the streets of heaven like? The book of Revelation says it's gold clear as crystal. Well, what does that mean? We don't know exactly. But crystal is like water turned into a diamond-like quality. The waters, the evil has been restored. The throne of God is described as being surrounded by a sea of crystal. That is the bridge. The waters of chaos, which originally separated us from God, now have been transformed and allow us to have access to the throne of God as well. And this church was built in the Depression, and they ran out of money, and they didn't have money for a nice floor, strangely by looking at this, and they asked the marble guy to use all the leftover pieces from his other jobs to make a jewel-like floor for the sanctuary of the church. 1960, Edward Schulte, church in Chicago area. Not full of Victorian angels and saccharine Marys holding lilies, but what is it? The walls of the heavenly Jerusalem in squares, and every now and then you see certain bright spots. They look like diamonds. There's faceted glass in there, so you move your head from left to right and you see little shots of light come out at you. It has an active, sparkling quality. These were designed by Anton Wendling of Germany. Even Antonin Raymond in 1959, who wanted to make this great modern church. This is a model that he built. All concrete, very modern, still looks like a church, and still has an eschatological component in the mural on the inside on the left where Christ is reigning in glory, surrounded by saints and stars and cosmology, eschatology, and doxology. Not a pointed arch to be found, not a Corinthian capital to be found, but nonetheless, the symbolic content is the same. The arguments you can make about whether modernism or traditional styles are better at evoking the heavenly Jerusalem, but even if you give it up, you still have the symbolic content to deal with. And here's an option, right? Church on the left, almost the same church on the right. One has an eschatological component with Christ reigning, surrounded by a golden crown, gold leaf on the ceiling. Instead of filling it with angels and saints, it's the crowns and crosses, because it's the Church of Christ the King that represent the stars and all the attendant beings of heaven. And this is a new church that was built not too long ago that I had some hand in, where they, again, kept this notion of the eschatological vision of the heavenly Jerusalem in mind. And here's another church by Edward Schulte in 1960, where he said, what is heaven doing? Angels and saints singing at the throne of God, and there they are. Very modern, incised black marble with gold leaf and then gold mosaic panels in between them. And notice how the cross is like a net that has caught 12 fish hanging from the sides of Christ. You would never confuse this for anything other than 1960, and yet you can say this is equally rich theologically and liturgically as something else. So when you finish up with here, I just got the 5-minute card here. The church is an image of Christ, and Christ composed of many members, the mystical body. So if you see a pile of rocks in front of a construction site, there's a bunch of rocks. Once were the side of a hill. Weeds were growing in them. What do? We take them out of the side of the hill. We shape them, we arrange them, we take chaos and give it cosmos. Now the cosmos of just anything but the ordered perfection of heaven. This is the uniting of the bride and groom to the heavenly city, made of living stones. It's festive, definitely festive. A wedding is a festive occasion. That's why we celebrate the liturgy. It's congregational, yes, we come together, but it's a mystical body in an ordered arrangement. They're legible words that we say, yet they're elevated and poetic words of love. You don't ask your wife to marry you by saying, hey, let's get hitched, right? You say, hey, how about we spend our lives together in love, have a family, live together, be happy, right? That's the language of the liturgy. That's the language of elevated architecture. And this is the biblical language too. There was, like the living stones, he was rejected, but you are living stones being built into a spiritual house. The spiritual reality is symbolized by the building itself. And we can close with this Urbs Beata Jerusalem. It's the song of First Vespers from the Common of the dedication of a church. And it's very short. Jerusalem, heavenly city, blessed vision of peace. Peace between humans and humans, between God and humans, between man, humanity, man and woman, built from living stones. That's us, transformed, raised on high to the heavens, and attended like a bride, because the church is the bride, waiting to meet its groom, by countless thousands of angels. Angels will attend the human divinized, which is something that's hard to comprehend. How happy the bride of such a favored destiny! Your rich endowment is the Father's glory. There's doxology again. And your comeliness, your beauty is from the bridegroom's grace. In other words, the groom gives us the grace to become beautiful and transformed. The queen, most beautiful, bride of Christ the King, radiant city of heaven. So there are all these singulars and plurals mixed up. One body made of many members. This is why when you sing morning prayer, you say, oh God, come to my assistance, even though there are 100 people in the room, because it's one body. It's not, oh God, come to our assistance. In this city, the gates of glittering pearls stand open for all to enter. There's a lot of symbolism of pearls, how an irritant, a little piece of sand inside an oyster, is transformed into something radiant and glorious. open for all to enter. Every man that follows the path of virtue must come to these gates, enduring sufferings for the love of Christ. So a crucifix is not just an earthly scene from a natural history museum. It's a glorious and radiant sacramental thing in a church, like this one here. Its stones are fashioned by many a stroke and blow of the Savior Mason's hammer and chisel. God is the stonemason forming us into what he wants us to be so that we can be inserted into our proper place in the heavenly Jerusalem. All these architectural analogies. And thus shaped, they go to the making of this mighty structure, each being fitly joined and finding its appointed place. Rich people need to be glorified. Poor people need to be glorified. Everyone needs to be glorified. So let due glory and honor be given to the Father, Most High, his only Son, and the renowned Paraclete. To God be praise, power, and glory. Here's the summary of architectural theology. This is architectural theology. There really is such a thing. And I often wish I could sound like James Earl Jones and say, this is architectural theology. But it is, right? This is not CNN. This is the theology of architecture. This is the mercy of God, who lets us delight in our own process of salvation. We don't have to go in a room and wish we became holy. We get to see it and enjoy it and delight in it. And this is the solemn duty of the church builder. Notice I didn't say pointed arch, didn't say Gothic, didn't say modern, didn't say Renaissance. What I said was this is ontology. This is the being of a church. And if you start with this, chances are the result will be a good product. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm going to go right into the next talk by Duncan Stroik and introduce him now. Professor Stroik is simultaneously a key figure in architectural education as a professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame, a practicing architect and founder of Duncan G. Stroik, LLC, a firm responsible for a number of completed Catholic church buildings in the United States, and editor and founder of the biannual journal Sacred Architecture. In his work as an educator, begun in 1990 at the University of Notre Dame, Professor Stroik has consistently been an unapologetic proponent of tradition itself as a great teacher. His interest lies in the classical tradition, and the principles of classical architecture and urbanism lie at the foundation of his pedagogy. In 1993, Professor Stroik began his own architectural practice, which focuses on work for the Catholic Church. Professor Stroik's church designs are well known around the world for their beauty and reverential character. They are examples of the possibility in the modern age to worship God together in a place that is dedicated to that purpose, that is beautiful and that seeks to connect the present with the past. The Sacred Architecture Journal is a magazine devoted exclusively to issues of church architecture from a Catholic perspective. This journal is an invaluable resource for all interested in Catholic sacred architecture. In fact, we have probably still copies in the front if you're interested. Thank you. So help me greet Professor Stroik.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, esteemed architects in the room. We have some very important architects today, especially sitting in the front row. Thank you for coming. And musicians, religious, priests, and members of the arts. Really have enjoyed this mix of talks in these 2 days. I think we've tried to cover a lot, and I'm not going to try to cover a lot. You just heard the whole deal. And I'm just going to try to focus on one thing that I think is important right now. But that's why we let Dennis start things off, and I just give a little coda here. I'd like to talk about originality and tradition. And how does one extend? This is one of the things that the conference proposes to talk about. How does one extend and transform the tradition of Catholic church architecture today? Now, I accept that some of you in the room think this is an irrelevant task. And since our time is totally different than all times before, and that tradition is over, I accept that. and I don't necessarily try to convince you otherwise. But I would like to remember something said early on in his pontificate by His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, because he talked about this issue. And he says, well, it all depends on the correct interpretation of the council. The problems in its implementation arose from the fact that two contrary hermeneutics came face to face and quarreled with each other. One caused confusion. The other, silently but more and more visibly, bore and is bearing fruit. On the one hand, there is an interpretation of what I would call a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. It has frequently availed itself of the sympathies of the mass media, and also one trend of modern theology. On the other hand, there is a hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the one subject, church, which the Lord has given to us. When these two buildings close to us today were first built, they were given great opprobrium. Not because they were ugly, nor were they dysfunctional, nor were they poorly built. They were criticized for a much more heinous crime, for being traditional. Why was being traditional considered so terrible in the 1940s and 1960s? Because they show no creativity. They do not reflect their time period. They might as well be mere copies, because they show no adventurousness, no minimalism or functionalism in their aesthetic. Yet these two buildings have outlived their critics, and most of the buildings built at the same time. Today, the National Gallery of Art can be considered one of the finest art galleries in the world. And the National Shrine is a great symbol of Catholicism in our nation's capital, where you go on Sunday and there's a United Nations of the faithful gathering. Now, architects and artists naturally want to invent or innovate. I believe that's very healthy, and it makes for a very rich society. However, there's also the concern that tradition stifles originality, and I would agree, if that were true, that that would be very bad. The great masterpieces of architecture down through the ages are put forward for their originality. We teach our students in the arts that the highest good is to be original. The reality is, of all the buildings, of all the churches that are built, even at our time, not all are actually going to be highly original. But our culture also recognizes brilliance and sets it up on a pedestal for its invention and innovation. Here are two buildings that were very innovative. In the 1400s, Leon Battista Alberti, we've heard a lot about him this weekend, did something very innovative in that he built a church, the first time a church, in fact, the first time a building that was occupied would be entered through a triumphal arch. And not only did he do that, but he combined it with a pediment. So it was very innovative at the time, and still considered today to be a great building. Another project to the right by Michelangelo, this is Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's, which, though was not built exactly this way, is also very, very important, because Michelangelo was the first architect to propose that a church be entered through a portico, through a temple front, through a colonnade with a pediment. This is the first time ever in history that a church would be entered this way. So two great architects, and I don't think you can really argue with Alberti, and I hope you won't argue with Michelangelo, because he was the best at all of the arts. But two great architects who were original, and we we are inspired by them, and we continue to go there and be inspired by these architects and these buildings. What about the Baldacchino by Bernini? There was nothing like it in size at its time. It was a work of technical bravura. In fact, it still is a work of technical bravura. I've tried to do bronze work, and some of you in this room have tried to do bronze work. Can you imagine having Solomonic columns that are tens and entablature and angels and cross and so on, that's 10 stories tall, and build it inside of a church? Can you imagine that? It's incredible. And it's also beautiful, and it's sculpted, and it has iconography. And it has the iconography of Eden and of paradise and of all the things that Dennis just pointed out. It was considered radical for its time because Bernini combined two ideas that had been used to shelter the holy place. One is the moving canopy held on wood columns that would accompany the Eucharist as it was traveled through the streets. He combined that idea, the temporary moving tent, which probably goes back to the tent in the wilderness, and he combined that with the permanent, solid baldacchino or ciborium of the ancient churches, even from the time of Constantine, where 4 columns out of marble would create the holy place. And you can see that fusion, that invention, especially with these columns that are Solomonic, that are wavy, they don't really look that structural. They're made out of bronze. And then look at this canopy. Look at this canopy. This light, moving, blowing in the wind element, and yet it's all out of bronze. So he fuses these two things, and it's a technical bravura, but it's also an architectural iconographic bravura. And at the time was considered very radical and was criticized until it was built and they saw it. And it was hard to criticize it after it was done. It is original on all different levels. And at the same time, it was inspired by the spiral columns, much smaller, given by the emperor to St. Peter's, which of course, that's why we call them Solomonic, were thought to be from the Temple of Solomon. And the consciousness of the church to connect back to that original temple of Judaism, of monotheism. And this Baldacchino, of course, has become a classic and has inspired many great Baldacchinos, especially I think of in France, but we have them in this country, and they're each unique, and there's even some humble, wimpy attempts at it. So I'm all for originality. I'm all for innovation, and I just bring up a few examples of that. There are tons to talk about in originality, but it can also be overrated. And since true originality on the order of Michelangelo or Bernini is actually very hard to find, who is the Bernini of today or the Michelangelo of today? We instead turn to novelty because each of us as architects is taught we have to be original just like Bernini and Michelangelo and Le Corbusier, and we all have to be the same way, and Frank Lloyd Wright. So what do? We turn to novelty. Novelty is much easier to do than to do something truly original. The cult of novelty means that anything goes, and it makes architects think that our role is to provide change for change's sake. One of the reasons we buy the idea of novelty is because we believe the syllogism that change in architecture is by definition the same as scientific innovation, which I think we should question. What is the architectural equivalent of the iPhone? Anything in architecture that is that successful and is adopted by a majority of architects would be considered by our profession as no longer innovative, as no longer original. Only the first one is original. You copy it, you make a couple of them, it's no longer original. As King Solomon wrote, there's nothing new under the sun. The reality is that modernism, while often invoking originality, was also greatly indebted to historical precedent, both architectural and machine. Of course, the protagonists of the modern movement, such as Le Corbusier, Gropius, Wright, Aalto, and Mies, were quite cognizant of history. They learned it very well in their day, and they claimed to be the fulfillment of it. But theirs was not so much a belief in history, but a belief in historicism, in which change always signifies progress. One of the ways modernism defines itself is as being different from the past, differentiating itself from things which have come before. Symmetry is replaced by asymmetry. Harmony is replaced by dissonance. Masonry is replaced by steel and concrete. Human scale by the machine-made. Hand craftsmanship with the industrial. And beauty with provocativeness. When I was in architecture school 25, 30 years ago, the word was never used. The B word was never used. It's coming back, which is good. If you read the leaders or the promoters of the modern movement, it becomes clear that they view modern man and the modern age as distinct from everything which came before. It is also of note that similarly to the Protestant Reformation, modernism defines itself as against images, ornament, history, tradition, and architectural language. It's the architecture of rupture, of discontinuity with the past. But is discontinuity an appropriate goal for the eternal church? It seems problematic for a representation of a church which teaches the relevance of goodness, truth, and beauty. If we study the history of sacred architecture through the lens of originality, there is certainly much richness, as has already been pointed out. Yet, I would argue we can study these same masterpieces through the lens of continuity and find that, yes, they're original, they're masterpieces, but they also have principles which are timeless and relevant today, and that they share with other great and not so great buildings. For instance, down through the ages, we can see a great continuity in the design of parts of a church. I offer you the idea of the sanctuary. In both of these disparate examples, a late Romanesque basilica in Rome, San Clemente, and a 20th century medievalizing church in Florida, in the U.S. We see a clearly defined sanctuary, we see a railing, we see materials, fine materials, a prominent altar. The surrounding or the walls and the ceiling of that area of the sanctuary is emphasized. It's a place set apart. They're very different buildings. Aesthetically, even in their use, they're a little different, and yet there's some commonalities. Also, we can look at the whole history of architecture and find all kinds of things to find continuity in. And I'm trying to promote the C word rather than the D word here, the continuity. But you can even zoom in and look at the parts. And we can start with, on the top left, Santa Sabina and this Corinthian capital down the nave of this early Christian basilica built in the 400s. We can go to a new interpretation of that and bunching of the columns with piers in a Romanesque building on the top right. We can jump down to Santa Maria in Todi on the left, bottom left, and you have symbols of St. Mark and wheat and grapes on the outside. And then my favorite, one of the most brilliant examples is in the chapel where the shroud of Turin was kept, the image that reflects Christ's passion. And here you have the Corinthian pilaster, the Passion capital, with a crown of thorns, with the dogwood leaf, with the nails, and with the INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the Passion capital. So even in the parts of architecture, then we have some humble modern examples here. There are wonderful innovations which, if successful, are employed by later architects. This imitation leads the original to become traditional. The innovation can be added to the tradition and thus change it. Most things that we think today, that people consider are traditional today, at one time were once new. Seems obvious, right? So take this nice Church of St. Jean-Baptiste in New York, one of my favorites. Let's talk about a couple of things here that seem very traditional. Bell towers. When did bell towers begin? In the Romanesque period. How about pairing of towers, even later? We've already talked about the temple pediment and portico, which is something that Michelangelo, you could say, invented, but it actually didn't come to pass until a little while later in northern Italy by a little less known architect named Andrea Palladio. And then, in fact, what about a church all built out of stone? That wasn't the way the early Christians built their buildings. So all these things that we think of on this exterior, very traditional, early 20th century, very traditional. Yes, but at one time, many elements, and we could go on, were new. What about here, San Giorgio Maggiore? The cruciform plan. The cruciform plan was not the classic solution for church buildings in the first 800 years of Christianity. The side altar placed in its own area, and you see the side aisles here with the little altars in the plan. That idea that the altar itself, or the shrine, or the specific area would have its own chapel within this building, that was a much later development. The high altar piece. The baptistry. When was the baptistry moved to the inside of a church? Originally, it was always connected with the cathedral, and it was always outside of the cathedral, and part of the ritual was going from the church to the baptistry back in. When did that happen? That's quite late. And then, of course, the artwork, the important things. I get as frustrated as other people when I come to a parish and I say, what do you want? And we want, what do we need to have? And we have to have Mary on the left, Joseph on the right, Stations of the Cross, and a crucifix in the center. I'm unhappy with that. Why? It's traditional. Yeah, it's traditional, but it's not the only way it's done. In fact, it's not the ancient way it's done. Stations come from the time of the Franciscans. Mary and Joseph seems like a fairly recent idea. Probably the Irish brought it, invented it, and the Germans in this country. As a formula, I'm talking. And the crucifix also, as the center of the sanctuary, was not the ancient solution. These are all good things. They're all traditional. I love them. I do them. But these are not requirements. And so many things that we think of. What about the tabernacle? We know that. Those of us who are schooled in liturgy, we know the tabernacle wasn't originally in the sanctuary. And therefore, since it wasn't in the sanctuary originally, we should get rid of it. Well, I think we're over that. But all of these things are developments, and we can appreciate them as developments. But again, many things that are traditional, seen as traditional today, were once new. I would say that all of these elements, and more so, are seen as part of the repertoire of Catholic architecture, though they're extremely traditional. We should be most thankful for the artists and architects of the past who sought to innovate or be original and passed on these wonderful solutions. These architects created new motifs, plans, or solutions without rejecting the basic ideas of wall and columnar architecture that were inherited from antiquity. They may have pushed the edges of tradition or even transformed the tradition, yet that did not mean a break with the past. Tradition is not the enemy of newness or originality. Rather, true originality gives the tradition new life. Have you ever thought that the rejection of tradition is also a rejection of the originality of the past? When you reject tradition and all these traditional elements, we're rejecting all the great architects who have gone on before and tried to innovate these things. No, rose windows, those are bad. I reject that architect's innovation. That was good for his time, it's irrelevant today. We're rejecting it. So I think if we have that view, we should wish and hope that future generations will reject our innovations in the same way, just as we reject our forefathers. So I would suggest, as an alternative, to harness the architect's natural drive to be original in service of the church is necessary. I'd like to propose that we learn from the great architects, not just of today, but of the past, who were original. Learn from those who are original. And then, if we want to really know if we've done it well, we'll have the guts to compare and contrast our work with these great architects. Then maybe we'll know if our contemporary work might measure up. What happened? Okay. That's one idea of a church. No, what I wanted here was imagine your parents, your parents, your grandparents, and you in a family picture here. The architecture of continuity and tradition is not interested in producing copies, but rather children. Children look like and sometimes act like their parents, for good or bad, yet they're individuals. An architecture of continuity is delighted to learn from the examples of the past, to understand the styles and appreciate their consistency. In order to accomplish something as good as or better than the past, one must know the architecture intimately. The traditional architect, if he is original, is not worried about it. It's not a big deal. But on the other hand, he's also not worried about doing an exact archaeological reconstruction. The clients might want that, but really the architect isn't. We know that of the great architects. Ralph Adams Cram comes to mind. Spoke a lot about against that archaeological. Looks like he's a neo-Gothicist, but he was very against the archaeological reconstruction. Now, I don't see archaeological reconstructions as somehow immoral, as a good modernist would, but the architect's goal is to do something greater than a copy or reconstruction. It's to have a child. One could argue, though, that the opposite of the copy is worse. Ignoring the serious study of the Gothic tradition and its richness, the architect throws some pointed arches together, some buttresses, some colonnettes, and this is what we get. And if he decides that he is the Frank Gehry of Gothic architecture, it becomes kind of scary. What's wrong with that? Well, the architect does not know the language well enough to design something competent, much less original. As Leo Nestor said, one needs to have fluency in the language. So it's a catch-22. One has to know the tradition in order to innovate, but in order to learn the tradition takes time, humility, and hard work, which sounds fairly antithetical to novelty. So the vast majority of churches that have been built or renovated recently in the U.S. are caught in between the impetus for novelty and the desire of the clients that it look like a church. These are neither innovative modernist masterpieces or competent traditional buildings. They are lukewarm. In some cases, they are just mediocre, but in others, they are schizophrenic. And so, does the traditionalist argue for mediocrity? It's unacceptable. Well, maybe for an office building. How about for a house? A hospital, a school, a functional building. How about a factory? But for a church, mediocrity? We're going to put up with that? So, if we don't think so, how do we get away from it? One suggestion is in designing a cruciform plan that we don't try to force the seating idea of a theater on it. Or to zoom in a little bit, if you're going to put arches on your buildings, and I don't have a problem with that, I think you should first understand how they're constructed and also look at the many ways that arches have been used in the past. Continuity with the great tradition can be learned, but it takes hard work. For some architects, it is analogous to a conversion. Think about the agnostic or the non-Catholic who grows in knowledge about the church and eventually falls in love with her, realizing that in her is truth. For architects, it is a similar thing to grow in love with the church and her history. That is also to fall in love with the art and architecture she has produced down through the ages. They're not separate things. Just as falling in love with a person, falling in love with the church's artistic tradition takes time and commitment. See, Dennis and I think a lot alike. It always gets back to marriage, right? The heavenly marriage. So how can architects participate in the great tradition, but with originality? Here I would like to develop a few ideas from the great 20th century poet T.S. Eliot in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. First of all, it's necessary to have the historical sense. This is not only a perception of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The past is present. This is perhaps easier to see in architecture than for other arts, since by definition our buildings last beyond our time and beyond our generation. The historical sense compels the architect to design not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of architecture of Christendom, and within it the whole of the architecture of the place that you're from, the US, Italy, Spain, wherever, has an existence. And so this historical sense is a sense of timelessness and temporalness together. This is a wonderful variation on at the École des Beaux-Arts on the School of Athens at the Vatican. Paul Delaroche painted it, and it has architects from all in the 19th century, architects from all periods of time meeting and discussing things. They're not in competition, they're not fighting, they're not arguing, they're actually discussing things. And there at the center are those who built the Parthenon. Phidias, the architect, Ictinus, the sculptor, and Apelles, the artist, symbolizing the unity of the arts. So on the left, Palladio speaks with the Gothic architect, Robert de Luzarche, while another group on the right, you see a number of architects standing in a circle off to the left there, and they're talking to Arnolfo di Cambio, who built the Duomo in Florence. The different periods, countries, and styles are seen as related by a common blood type and endeavor. The goal of the contemporary church architect should be part of this conversation. The architect's appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead architects. You cannot value him alone. You must place him for contrast and comparison among the dead. Just as the present is directed by the past, so the past is altered by the present. This means that the work of the architect is quite difficult and full of great responsibility, because we're not just altering the present, we're altering the past. In Eliot's view, we are judged, not amputated, by the standards of the past. When we speak about the comparison with the masterpieces of the past, we're talking about a comparison in which both are measured. Ultimately, our work will be judged to be as good as, worse than, or better than the examples of the past. Here are 5 different altars in churches throughout history. The architect must be conscious of the main current of art and architecture, which flows variably through the most distinguished reputations. There is development and refinement, but not necessarily improvement, not progress. This is Eliot. It is a silly idea to believe that the Byzantine improved on the early Christian, and that the Romanesque was much better than the Byzantine. Oh, and then Gothic. It's far superior to that lowly Romanesque. And then came the Renaissance and the Baroque, and they just kept improving and improving. And so today, we're finally at the apogee of architecture. This is progress. This is silly. We should appreciate all periods for their particular strengths and differences with other styles. But again, focus on their continuities and similarities, as well as their differences. Consciousness of the past takes study. It takes a surrender of the architect to something which is more valuable. The progress of a person is continual self-sacrifice. Again, this is Eliot. A continual extinction of personality. How can a great poet talk about extinction of personality? The artist is being called to follow the example of the saints. Aren't the saints the great example of extinction of personality, and yet don't they just jump out of the pages, out of the artwork to be real? St. Francis, St. Dominic, Mother Teresa. These are people that are larger than life, and yet they extinguished themselves. To reach impersonality, the architect must surrender himself to the work. He will only know what is to be done if he lives not only in the present, but in the living present of the past. Architects and artists exercise their gifts of creativity and originality for the benefit of the church and to the glory of God. Originality does not have to be an enemy of tradition, but it should be in the service of tradition. If we are going to express the faith which is ever ancient, ever new, we should seek to marry the two. Thus, we can create temples of the Lord which are judged by, but also converse with, the great architecture and saints of the past. Thank you very much.